Bullies mock the quiet kid. They had no idea. He was an underground fighting champion. Marcus Delacroix stood at his locker, methodically organizing his textbooks, while the chaos of Riverside High swirled around him. At 17, he possessed an almost ghostly presence in the crowded hallways, his lean frame draped in oversized hoodies that seemed to swallow his modest build. His dark hair fell across his eyes like a curtain, and he moved with the deliberate care of someone who had learned that drawing attention meant inviting trouble. The other students barely registered his existence, which was exactly how Marcus preferred it. He had transferred to Riverside 3 months ago when his father's construction job relocated them across the state, and he had no intention of making waves in his final year of high school. The morning ritual was always the same. Marcus would arrive early, navigate to his locker, gather his materials, and slip into his first period class before the hallways became too congested. He had mapped out the quietest routes between classes, identified the bathroom stalls that were least likely to be occupied, and even timed his lunch periods to avoid the peak social hours. This careful choreography had served him well in his previous schools, and he saw no reason to abandon it now. Unfortunately, his invisibility cloak had recently begun to fail him. "Well, well, look what we have here," came a voice that made Marcus's shoulders tense involuntarily. He didn't need to turn around to know that Bryce Kellerman was approaching, flanked by his usual entourage of admirers and enablers. Bryce was everything that Marcus was not: tall, broad-shouldered, with perfectly styled blonde hair, and the kind of confident swagger that came from never having to question his place in the social hierarchy. As the star quarterback and son of the town's most successful real estate developer, Bryce had grown accustomed to the world bending to his will. Marcus continued organizing his locker, hoping that if he didn't acknowledge the intrusion, it might simply evaporate. This strategy had worked occasionally in the past, though he suspected his luck was running out. "I'm talking to you, ghost boy," Bryce continued, stepping closer until Marcus could smell the expensive cologne that seemed to follow the quarterback everywhere. "You know it's considered polite to answer when someone's trying to have a conversation with you." Marcus finally turned, keeping his expression carefully neutral. "Sorry, I was just getting my books." "Just getting your books," Bryce repeated in a mocking tone, earning chuckles from his companions. There was Devon Martinez, a stocky wrestler, with arms like tree trunks and a cruel smile that never seemed to fade, and Tyler Oakes, whose wiry frame belied a vicious streak that had earned him a reputation for creative harassment. "You hear that, guys? He was just getting his books like he's got somewhere important to be." The three of them had been circling Marcus like sharks for weeks now, testing his boundaries with increasingly bold provocations. It had started small, a shoulder check in the hallway here, a snide comment about his thrift store clothes there, but Marcus could sense the escalation, could feel the predatory patience wearing thin. They were building towards something, and he suspected that morning might be the beginning of the end of his carefully maintained anonymity. "Maybe he's rushing off to another one of his study sessions," Devon suggested with a laugh. "I heard from Jenny Castillo that you spend lunch in the library every single day. What kind of loser does that?" Marcus felt heat rise in his cheeks but kept his voice steady. "I just like to read." "He just likes to read," Tyler echoed in a high-pitched voice that bore no resemblance to Marcus's actual tone. "Guys, I think we found ourselves a genuine bookworm, the endangered species of teenage male who actually enjoys homework." The warning bell rang, and Marcus saw his opportunity for escape. He grabbed his remaining books and attempted to close his locker, but Bryce's hand shot out and slammed it shut before Marcus could retrieve his chemistry textbook. "Where are you going so fast?" Bryce asked, his voice dropping to a more menacing register. "We were just getting to know each other." "I don't want to be late for class," Marcus replied, trying to step around the trio, but they shifted to block his path. "Class can wait," Devon said, cracking his knuckles with theatrical emphasis. "We've got plenty of time for a little chat." Marcus's mind raced through his options. The hallway was emptying rapidly as students hurried to beat the final bell, and the few stragglers who remained were carefully avoiding eye contact. This was a lesson he had learned long ago. In the social ecosystem of high school, intervening in someone else's harassment was a luxury that most students couldn't afford. The survival instinct demanded that you keep your head down and be grateful that you weren't the target. "Look," Marcus said quietly, "I really don't want any trouble. Can we just not do this?" The question seemed to delight his tormentors, and Bryce's grin widened. "Not do what? We're just being friendly, isn't that right, guys?" "Super friendly," Tyler agreed, reaching out to flick Marcus's ear with his finger. The physical contact sent a jolt through Marcus's system, not of pain, but of something much more dangerous. For just a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked, and something cold and calculating flickered behind his eyes. His muscles tensed in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with muscle memory that ran deeper than conscious thought. Then the moment passed, and Marcus forced himself to relax. Not here, he reminded himself. Not now. Not unless you absolutely have to. I should really get to class, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. Bryce studied him for a long moment, and Marcus had the uncomfortable feeling that the quarterback was seeing more than he should. There was an intelligence behind those blue eyes that people often underestimated, a predatory cunning that had served him well both on the football field and in the complex social battles of high school dominance. You know what, Ghost Boy, Bryce said finally. You're right, you should get to class. We wouldn't want you to be late on our account. He stepped aside with exaggerated courtesy, and Marcus moved quickly toward his chemistry class, acutely aware of the 3 pairs of eyes tracking his movement. He could hear their laughter echoing behind him, and he knew with grim certainty that this was only the beginning. The rest of the morning passed in a haze of anxiety and anticipation. Marcus found it nearly impossible to concentrate on his lessons, his mind constantly replaying the encounter and trying to predict what would come next. He had been through this dance before at his previous schools, and he recognized the signs. The predators had identified their prey, tested his responses, and found them satisfactory. The real hunting would begin soon. During his second period, English class, Marcus caught sight of Bryce passing by the window in the hallway. The quarterback made a point of stopping, meeting Marcus's eyes through the glass and drawing a finger slowly across his throat. The message was unmistakable, and several of Marcus's classmates noticed the exchange, their whispered conversations creating a buzz of anticipation that made his skin crawl. By lunchtime, word had apparently spread through the school's invisible communication network that something was brewing. Marcus could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him as he made his way to the cafeteria, and conversations seemed to die as he passed. He considered skipping lunch entirely and hiding out in the library as usual, but his stomach was growling, and he suspected that avoiding the confrontation would only make it worse when it finally came. The cafeteria at Riverside High was a carefully orchestrated social ecosystem, with each table representing a different tier of the high school hierarchy. The athletes dominated the center of the room, their voices booming across the space as they recounted weekend exploits and planned future conquests. The theater kids clustered near the windows, their animated discussions punctuated by dramatic gestures and bursts of laughter. The academic elite maintained their quiet corner, heads buried in textbooks even during their lunch break. And then there were the islands of solitude, the single tables occupied by students who, for various reasons, existed outside the established social order. Marcus had claimed one of these tables on his first day at Riverside, and it had become his refuge from the chaos of adolescent social warfare. He was halfway through his sandwich when he noticed the unusual quiet that had fallen over the cafeteria. Conversations hadn't stopped entirely, but they had dropped to conspiratorial whispers, and he could feel the electric tension that preceded a significant social event. His instincts screamed at him to leave, to abandon his lunch and seek sanctuary in the library, but he forced himself to remain seated. Running would only confirm his status as prey and make the eventual confrontation that much worse. Bryce appeared at his table as if materializing from thin air, his plastic lunch tray landing on the surface with a sharp crack that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent cafeteria. "Mind if I sit?" Bryce asked, though he was already lowering himself into the chair across from Marcus. Devon and Tyler flanked him on either side, their own trays forgotten as they focused entirely on the show that was about to unfold. "It's a free country," Marcus replied, taking another bite of his sandwich with forced casualness. "That it is," Bryce agreed, unwrapping what appeared to be an elaborate sandwich constructed from premium ingredients. "You know, I've been thinking about our conversation this morning, and I realized that we didn't really get a chance to finish it. There's so much I don't know about you, Marcus. That is your name, right?" Marcus. The use of his name sent a chill down Marcus's spine. It meant that Bryce had been asking questions, gathering intelligence, treating this harassment campaign with the same strategic approach he brought to football. "That's right," Marcus confirmed. "Marcus," Bryce repeated, as if tasting the syllables. "It's a strong name. Roman, isn't it? Like Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. Very fitting for someone who spends so much time with books." The classical reference surprised Marcus, and Bryce caught his reaction with evident satisfaction. You didn't expect me to know that, did you? Bryce continued. People make a lot of assumptions about athletes. They think we're all muscle and no brains. But here's the thing, Marcus. You can't be successful at quarterback if you don't understand strategy, if you don't know how to read your opponents and exploit their weaknesses. Marcus set down his sandwich, his appetite evaporating as he recognized the threat hidden in Bryce's words. What do you want? He asked directly. Want? Bryce laughed, the sound carrying clearly across the silent cafeteria. I don't want anything from you, Marcus. I'm just trying to be neighborly, trying to help you understand how things work around here. And how do things work around here? Bryce leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that somehow seemed more menacing than if he had shouted. Well, that's the interesting thing about social ecosystems, he said. They're all about balance, you see. Everyone has their place, their role to play. The problem arises when someone doesn't understand where they fit in the food chain. He paused to take a bite of his sandwich, chewing thoughtfully while maintaining eye contact with Marcus. Now, I've been watching you for a few weeks, Bryce continued, and I can't quite figure out where you belong. You're not athletic enough to sit with us. You're not smart enough to hang with the academic crowd. I checked your grades, by the way. Solid B+ average, but nothing spectacular. You're not artistic enough for the theater kids, not alternative enough for the goths, not wealthy enough for the trust fund babies. Each categorization hit Marcus like a small slap, and he could see the cruel intelligence behind Bryce's systematic analysis. So that leaves us with a problem, Bryce said, because in nature, when an organism doesn't have a clear ecological niche, it usually means one of two things. Either it's an apex predator that doesn't need to worry about classification, or it's prey that exists solely to feed the organisms above it in the food chain. The metaphor hung in the air between them, and Marcus could feel the attention of the entire cafeteria focused on their table. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was theater, a public demonstration designed to establish dominance and send a message to anyone else who might be considering stepping out of line. Now, looking at you, Bryce continued, his eyes traveling deliberately over Marcus's slight frame, I'm pretty confident which category you fall into. The question is whether you're going to accept that classification gracefully or whether we're going to have to teach you the hard way. Marcus felt something shift inside him, a familiar coldness that he had spent months trying to suppress. His breathing slowed, his vision sharpened, and for just a moment, the cafeteria around him seemed to fade away. He could see the pulse, point in Bryce's neck, could calculate the exact angle and force needed to incapacitate him with a single strike, could map out the sequence of movements that would leave all three of his tormentors on the floor before they understood what had happened. Not yet, he told himself firmly. You're not there yet. I think, Marcus said carefully, that I'll just finish my lunch and go to class. Bryce's smile widened, and Marcus realized that he had given exactly the response that the quarterback had been hoping for. Of course you will, Bryce said, reaching across the table to pat Marcus condescendingly on the shoulder. Because you're a good student who doesn't want any trouble. The pat became a squeeze, Bryce's fingers digging into the muscle of Marcus's shoulder, with just enough pressure to be painful, without being obvious to observers. But here's the thing about trouble, Marcus, Bryce whispered, his grip tightening. Sometimes it finds you whether you want it or not. He released Marcus's shoulder and stood up, his companions following suit like well-trained soldiers. Enjoy the rest of your lunch, Bryce said pleasantly, loud enough for the surrounding. Tables to here. We'll see you around. The trio departed, and gradually the normal noise level of the cafeteria resumed, though Marcus could still feel curious glances directed his way. He sat alone at his table, his sandwich forgotten, trying to process what had just happened and what it meant for his carefully constructed existence at Riverside High. The message had been delivered with crystalline clarity. The predators had identified their prey, established the power dynamic, and set the stage for whatever was to come. Marcus had played his part perfectly, responding with exactly the kind of submissive behavior that would encourage further aggression. But as he sat there in the aftermath of the confrontation, Marcus allowed himself a small, cold smile. Because while Bryce Kellerman was undoubtedly intelligent and strategic, he had made one crucial error in his analysis. He had assumed that Marcus's quiet demeanor and avoidance of conflict indicated weakness, when in reality, it indicated something far more dangerous: control. Marcus Delacroix had been fighting since he was 7 years old, not in school playgrounds or weekend brawls, but in underground circuits where money changed hands and blood was the currency of respect. His father, Jean-Baptiste Delacroix, had been a fighter himself before an injury ended his career, and he had passed on not just technique, but philosophy to his son. The first rule of underground fighting was simple. Never let anyone know what you're capable of until the moment you decide to show them. Marcus had learned to mask his abilities, to move through the world like a ghost, precisely because he understood what he was capable of when pushed too far. The careful choreography of his daily routine wasn't born from social anxiety. It was a disciplined practice, designed to avoid situations where his carefully maintained facade might crack. But that facade was cracking now, and Marcus could feel the familiar hunger stirring in his chest. The hunger for combat, for the clean simplicity of physical confrontation, where strength and skill determined outcomes instead of social hierarchies and political maneuvering. Soon, he promised himself, as he finally disposed of his uneaten lunch. But not yet. The afternoon classes passed in a blur of anticipation and careful observation. Marcus could feel the shift in the school's social atmosphere, could sense the expectation building like pressure before a storm. Students who had never paid him any attention were now stealing glances in his direction, and he caught fragments of whispered conversations that confirmed his suspicions. Word of the cafeteria confrontation had spread, and the consensus seemed to be that the quiet new kid was about to learn a hard lesson about Riverside High's unwritten rules. It was during his final period study hall that the next phase of Bryce's campaign began. Marcus was sitting in the back row of the library, trying to concentrate on his chemistry homework, when Tyler Oakes materialized beside his table like a malevolent spirit. "Hey there, bookworm," Tyler said, his voice pitched just loud enough to carry to the surrounding tables, but not loud enough to attract the librarian's attention. "Bryce wanted me to give you a message." Marcus looked up from his textbook, meeting Tyler's eyes with carefully maintained neutrality. "He wanted you to know that he's really looking forward to continuing your conversation after school," Tyler continued, perching on the edge of Marcus's table with deliberate casualness. "He thought you might enjoy a more private setting where you could really get to know each other." The implication was unmistakable, and Marcus felt his pulse quicken despite his efforts to remain calm. "I usually catch the bus right after school," Marcus said quietly. "Oh, don't worry about the bus," Tyler replied with a grin. "Bryce is happy to give you a ride home. He's very thoughtful that way." Marcus understood that this wasn't a request or even a threat. It was a notification of what was going to happen, delivered with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance to their will. "What if I don't want a ride?" Marcus asked, though he already knew the answer. Tyler's grin widened, showing teeth that seemed too sharp for comfort. "Well, that would be pretty rude, don't you think? Bryce is just trying to be friendly. It would be a shame if you hurt his feelings by refusing his offer." The subtext was clear enough. Marcus could accept the ride and whatever came with it, or he could refuse and face the consequences of that refusal. Either way, the confrontation was coming, and his only choice was the venue. "Tell Bryce I appreciate the offer," Marcus said finally, "but I think I'll stick with the bus." Tyler's expression didn't change, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. "I'll make sure he gets the message," Tyler said, sliding off the table. "He'll be so disappointed. He was really looking forward to spending some quality time with you." Tyler departed, leaving Marcus alone with his churning thoughts and the growing certainty that his time at Riverside High was about to take a dramatic turn. He tried to return to his homework, but the equations seemed to blur together, and he found himself instead thinking about his father's lessons. The most important thing, Jean-Baptiste had told him during one of their late-night training sessions in the garage behind their old house, is to choose your battles carefully. Not every fight is worth having, but when you do decide to fight, you fight to win, completely and decisively. Marcus had taken that lesson to heart, had built his entire approach to conflict around the concept of strategic patience. But he was beginning to suspect that his patience was about to be tested beyond its limits. The final bell rang with an almost ominous finality, and Marcus gathered his materials with deliberate care. The hallways were already beginning to empty, as students rushed toward buses, cars, and after-school activities, but Marcus forced himself to maintain his usual methodical pace. Panic would only make things worse, and he needed to think clearly about his next moves. He made it halfway to his locker before Bryce appeared, flanked by Devon and Tyler, like some kind of supernatural manifestation of high school hierarchy. "Marcus," Bryce called out with theatrical enthusiasm. "Perfect timing. I was just telling the guys how excited I am to give you that ride home we talked about." The hallway around them had mostly cleared, leaving only a handful of stragglers who quickened their pace when they sensed the tension in the air. The few who remained seemed to understand that they were about to witness something significant, and they positioned themselves at a safe distance to observe. "Actually," Marcus said, continuing toward his locker, "I decided to catch the bus. After all." "The bus?" Bryce repeated, falling into step beside him. "But Marcus, the bus is so public, so crowded. Don't you think you'd be more comfortable in my car? We could take the scenic route, maybe stop somewhere quiet where we could really talk." They had reached Marcus's locker, and he began working the combination with hands that he forced to remain steady. He could feel the three of them watching his every movement, could sense their anticipation building toward some kind of crescendo. "I really appreciate the offer," Marcus said, pulling out his jacket, "but I'm fine with the bus." "The thing is," Devon interjected, his voice carrying a note of barely contained aggression, "Bryce doesn't like it when people refuse his generosity. It makes him feel unappreciated. And we don't like it when Bryce feels unappreciated," Tyler added helpfully. Marcus closed his locker and turned to face them, his backpack slung over one shoulder. The hallway had grown even quieter, and he could hear the distant sound of bus engines starting up in the parking lot. "Look," he said, trying one final time to defuse the situation, "I don't want any trouble. Can't we just leave it alone?" Bryce studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see the calculation happening behind those blue eyes. The quarterback was weighing options, considering approaches, treating this like the strategic problem he had described it as during lunch. "You know what, Marcus?" Bryce said finally. "You're absolutely right. We should leave it alone." The words were so unexpected that Marcus felt a momentary surge of hope, quickly followed by suspicion. This was too easy, too clean. Predators like Bryce didn't simply walk away from established prey without extracting some kind of toll. "But first," Bryce continued, his voice dropping to that familiar conspiratorial whisper, "I think we need to settle a small matter of respect." Before Marcus could process the words fully, Bryce's hand shot out and grabbed the strap of his backpack, yanking it hard enough to throw Marcus off balance. The bag came free, and Bryce held it up like a trophy while Marcus stumbled backward against the lockers. "Oops," Bryce said with mock concern. "Looks like you dropped something." He unzipped the main compartment and began pulling out Marcus's belongings, textbooks, notebooks, pens, and pencils, letting them fall to the floor in a cascade of scattered academic materials. "Careful there, Bryce," Tyler said with theatrical worry. "You're making a mess." "You're right," Bryce agreed, upending the bag completely and shaking out the remaining contents. "We should clean this up." He kicked one of Marcus's textbooks, sending it skidding across the linoleum floor with a sound that echoed through the empty hallway. "There we go," Bryce said, dropping the empty backpack at Marcus's feet. "Much better." Marcus stared at his scattered belongings, feeling something dark and cold unfurling in his chest. This wasn't just harassment anymore, it was humiliation, a deliberate attempt to strip away his dignity in front of witnesses. The careful control he had maintained for months was beginning to crack, and he could feel something dangerous stirring beneath the surface. "Pick it up," he said quietly. The words surprised everyone, including Marcus himself. They had emerged from some deep place inside him, carrying a weight and authority that seemed to transform the very air around them. Bryce blinked, apparently taken aback by the sudden shift in Marcus's demeanor. "What did you say?" "I said pick it up." Marcus's voice was still quiet, but there was something in it now that made Devon and Tyler exchange uncertain glances. "You made the mess. Clean it up." For a moment, the hallway was completely silent, except for the distant hum of fluorescent lights. Bryce stared at Marcus as if seeing him for the first time, his expression cycling through surprise, confusion, and finally settling on something that looked like genuine anger. "Are you giving me orders?" Bryce asked, his voice rising to a more dangerous register. Marcus looked at his scattered possessions, then back at Bryce, and something fundamental shifted inside him. The careful facade that he had maintained for months, the strategic patience that had governed his every interaction, suddenly felt like an unbearable weight. This is it, he realized. This is where it ends. "I'm asking you nicely," Marcus said, taking a step forward. "Pick up my things." The movement was subtle, but something about Marcus's posture had changed. His shoulders squared, his stance widened slightly, and his hands hung loose at his sides in a way that suggested readiness rather than relaxation. To an untrained observer, it might have looked like nothing more than teenage defiance. But Devon, who had spent years grappling with opponents on wrestling mats, recognized the signs of someone preparing for combat. "Bryce," Devon said quietly, Maybe we should what?" Bryce snapped, his attention still fixed on Marcus. Maybe we should let this little nobody tell us what to do. Maybe we should forget about teaching him his place in the food chain. He took a step toward Marcus, closing the distance between them to just a few feet. Here's what's going to happen, Bryce said, his voice dropping back to that dangerous whisper. You're going to get down on your hands and knees, pick up every single one of your precious books, and thank me for the lesson in respect. Then you're going to walk your skinny ass outside where my car is waiting, and we're going to take that ride I offered you. The ultimatum hung in the air between them, and Marcus could feel the weight of decision pressing down on him. He thought about his father's lessons, about the underground circuits where reputation was earned with blood and maintained with careful strategy. He thought about the months of careful invisibility, the strategic retreat from every potential confrontation. And then he thought about how tired he was of running. No, Marcus said simply. The word seemed to echo in the empty hallway, and Marcus could see the shock register on Bryce's face. This wasn't how the script was supposed to go. The prey was supposed to submit, to accept their place in the hierarchy, and provide the satisfaction of dominance that the predator craved. What did you just say to me? Bryce asked, his voice rising to a near shout. I said no, Marcus repeated, his voice gaining strength and clarity. I'm not picking up anything, I'm not getting in your car, and I'm not playing your little dominance games anymore. For a moment, Bryce seemed too stunned to respond. In his experience, quiet kids didn't suddenly develop backbones. Prey animals didn't turn around and bare their teeth at approaching predators. The natural order of things was being violated in a way that challenged his fundamental understanding of how the world worked. But then his face darkened, and Marcus could see the violence building behind his eyes. You little shit, Bryce snarled, his hands clenching into fists. Do you have any idea who you're talking to? Do you know what I can do to you? Probably about the same thing you've been doing to me for weeks, Marcus replied, with a calmness that surprised even him. The only difference is that now I'm not going to pretend to be afraid of it. The transformation was complete now. The careful mask of submission had fallen away entirely, revealing something that made Devon's wrestler instincts scream warnings and caused Tyler to take an unconscious step backward. Marcus stood differently, moved differently, even breathed differently. The quiet, invisible student had been replaced by something altogether more dangerous. You want to know the funny thing about predators? Marcus asked, his voice carrying a conversational tone that somehow made his words more menacing than if he had shouted them. They're usually only brave when they think their prey can't fight back. Bryce's face flushed red with rage, and Marcus could see the moment when rational thought gave way to pure aggressive instinct. That's it, Bryce growled, drawing back his fist. I'm going to beat you so bad that... He never finished the sentence. Marcus moved with a speed and precision that seemed to defy physics, his body flowing like water around Bryce's clumsy punch. His right hand caught Bryce's extended wrist, his left found the quarterback's elbow, and with a movement so smooth it looked almost gentle, he redirected all of Bryce's momentum and sent him crashing face first into the bank of lockers. The B sound of impact echoed through the hallway like a gunshot, and Bryce crumpled to the floor, blood streaming from his nose and a look of stunned disbelief on his face. Devon reacted first, his wrestling training kicking in as he lunged toward Marcus with a roar of rage. But Marcus was already moving, sidestepping the charge and driving his knee up into Devon's solar plexus with surgical precision. The wrestler doubled over, gasping for air, and Marcus's elbow found the back of his neck with just enough force to send him to the ground without causing permanent damage. Tyler, seeing his two friends dispatched in a matter of seconds, tried to retreat, but Marcus was on him before he could take more than a step. A simple foot sweep sent Tyler sprawling, and when he tried to scramble back to his feet, Marcus's hand on his shoulder pushed him firmly back down. Stay, Marcus said quietly, and something in his voice convinced Tyler that obedience was his safest option. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 10 seconds. Marcus stood over the three fallen bullies, his breathing barely elevated, his clothes still perfectly neat. The careful control that had governed his every action for months hadn't abandoned him. It had simply been redirected toward a more active purpose. Here's what's going to happen, Marcus said, his voice carrying the same conversational tone that had preceded the violence. You're going to pick up my things, all of them, and you're going to apologize for making me miss my bus. Bryce struggled to a sitting position, his hand pressed to his bleeding nose, staring at Marcus as if he were some kind of supernatural apparition. What the hell are you? Bryce mumbled through the blood. Marcus considered the question seriously. I'm someone who tried really hard to avoid this conversation. he said finally. "But since you insisted on having it, I thought I should give you my full attention." He gestured toward the scattered books and papers. "Now, about cleaning up this mess." The aftermath moved with dreamlike surrealism. Bryce, Devon, and Tyler gathered Marcus's belongings with the mechanical compliance of people whose understanding of reality had been fundamentally shaken. They worked in silence, occasionally stealing glances at Marcus as if trying to reconcile the quiet student they thought they knew with the controlled violence they had just witnessed. Word of the confrontation spread through Riverside High with the supernatural speed that only teenage gossip networks could achieve. By the next morning, Marcus found himself transformed from invisible nobody to the subject of whispered legends and speculative theories. Some students claimed he was a martial arts master, others suggested military training, and a few creative. Souls proposed that he might be connected to organized crime. The truth, Marcus reflected as he walked through hallways that now parted before him like the Red Sea, was simultaneously simpler and more complex than any of their theories. He was just someone who had finally decided to stop running. The bullies never bothered him again. Bryce returned to school the following week with a bandaged nose and a newfound respect for the power of underestimating one's opponents. Devon developed a sudden interest in studying during lunch periods, and Tyler seemed to discover an urgent need to be elsewhere whenever Marcus appeared. But Marcus took no satisfaction in their fear. Violence, his father had taught him, was a tool to be used sparingly, and only when absolutely necessary. It was not a solution to life's problems, but rather a last resort when all other options had been exhausted. The real victory, Marcus realized, wasn't in the physical confrontation, but in the decision to stop accepting a role that others had tried to force upon him. He had spent months trying to be invisible, trying to avoid conflict, trying to conform to other people's expectations of who he should be. Now, walking through the halls of Riverside High with his head held high, Marcus understood that sometimes the most radical act was simply refusing to be what others expected you to be. He still spent lunch periods in the library, but now it was because he chose to, not because he was hiding. He still avoided unnecessary confrontations, but now it was from a position of strength rather than weakness. And when new students arrived at Riverside High, looking lost and vulnerable, Marcus made it a point to introduce himself, not as a protector or a savior, but simply as someone who understood that high school hierarchies were not immutable laws of nature, but temporary arrangements that could be challenged by anyone brave enough to refuse their assigned role. The quiet kid had found his voice, and it turned out to be more powerful than anyone had imagined.